The most revealing royal changes rarely begin with a public announcement. Sometimes, they appear in a financial report, a missing name, or a quiet decision that says more than any palace statement ever could. And now, Prince William, the Prince of Wales, has found himself at the center of a question Buckingham Palace may not want discussed too loudly. On the surface, this looked like a routine administrative change inside one of Britain's oldest royal estates. A staffing adjustment, a change of direction, perhaps even the normal housekeeping that happens when a new generation takes control. But when the name involved belonged to Annabel Elliot, the younger sister of Queen Camilla, the story immediately became something far more sensitive. Because this was not just about interior design. It was not simply about who decorates cottages, restores old rooms, or advises on the style of royal properties. It was about access. It was about family connections. And more quietly, it was about what happens when the future king begins reviewing the arrangements created during his father's long years as Prince of Wales. Prince William became the 25th Duke of Cornwall when King Charles III acceded to the throne in September 2022, giving William responsibility for the Duchy of Cornwall, the vast private estate traditionally held by the monarch's eldest son and heir. The duchy itself confirms that William took on that role after his father became king. That single constitutional change carried enormous meaning. For decades, King Charles III had shaped the duchy in his own image. It reflected his interests, his priorities, his environmental ideas, his charities, his household, and, inevitably, his circle of trust. Then, almost overnight, the estate passed into William's hands. The ledgers, the properties, the responsibilities, the traditions, and the private influence attached to the duchy were no longer Charles's to command. And that is where the first real tension begins. Annabel Elliot had been connected to duchy work for many years, reportedly providing interior design services for properties associated with the estate after King Charles, then Prince of Wales, appointed her in 2005. Reports later noted that under Prince William's first full year managing the duchy, she was not rehired, with sources stressing that the decision was not a criticism of her work. That detail matters, because officially, the language around the decision was measured. There was no dramatic palace statement, no public accusation, no open family rupture. The explanation was practical. Work had been completed, skills had been passed on, and the new Duke of Cornwall was making his own decisions about the estate. But in royal life, practical decisions can carry symbolic weight, especially when they involve relatives of the Queen. Was this simply Prince William modernizing an inherited estate? Or was it the first visible sign that the Prince of Wales intends to draw a firmer line between royal duty and private family favor? That is the question that made this story spread far beyond a simple staffing change. For older royal watchers, especially those who remember the long and painful history between King Charles III, Diana, Princess of Wales, and Queen Camilla, the emotional background is impossible to ignore. Prince William is not just another senior royal taking over a portfolio. He is Diana's eldest son. He is the future king. And he is now responsible for an estate that once gave his father great independence, influence, and financial stability during some of the most difficult years in modern royal history. That does not mean William acted out of revenge. Buckingham Palace has not publicly confirmed any such motive, and it would be careless to present private feelings as fact. But royal commentary often works in the space between the official explanation and the public memory attached to a decision. And in this case, the public memory is powerful. The British royal family is an institution built on continuity, but continuity can become complicated when one generation inherits the decisions of another. What one reign treats as normal, the next may quietly reconsider. What one household accepts as loyalty, another may see as overfamiliarity. And what one prince builds over decades, another prince may feel responsible for reshaping. That is why this moment feels larger than Annabel Elliot herself. By all public accounts, Annabel is an accomplished interior designer, and reports have made clear that the decision not to continue her duchy work was not presented as a reflection on her ability. But inside the royal imagination, her name connects to something bigger: Queen Camilla's family, Charles's long-standing private world, and the question of how much influence that world should continue to have now that William has entered a new phase of power. And this is where Prince William's public image becomes important. The Prince of Wales has spent years presenting himself as steady, disciplined, and careful. He rarely appears impulsive. He does not usually answer family tensions with public emotion. Unlike Prince Harry, the Duke of Sussex, William has remained largely silent about the most painful private chapters of royal life. But silence should never be mistaken for passivity. In royal institutions, the most consequential choices are often made through structure, staffing, access, and timing. A name disappears from an annual report. A long-standing arrangement is not renewed. A new leader chooses a new direction. No doors slam. No voices are raised. And yet everyone understands that something has changed. For Queen Camilla, the optics are delicate. As queen, she stands beside King Charles III in public duty, and she has built a visible role through charity work, literacy advocacy, support for domestic abuse survivors, and representation of the crown. But her position has always carried the weight of public history. To some, she is a woman who endured years of criticism and eventually earned acceptance. To others, especially devoted admirers of Diana, Princess of Wales, her rise remains emotionally difficult. That divided public feeling means any decision involving Queen Camilla's family will be watched closely. Even if the official explanation is simple, the interpretation becomes complicated. Was William merely tightening the duchy's operations? Was he reducing dependence on personal connections? Was he signaling that his future reign will look different from his father's? Or was this a careful, understated reminder that the next chapter of the monarchy will not be shaped entirely by the loyalties of the last one? Those questions are not small. They go to the heart of what the monarchy is becoming. Because Prince William is no longer only the popular son of Diana or the supportive husband of Catherine, Princess of Wales. He is now a direct institutional force. He controls a historic estate. He represents the future of the crown. And every decision he makes is studied for clues about how he may one day rule. That is why the Duchy of Cornwall matters. It is not merely land, income, farms, cottages, and ancient privilege. It is a training ground for kingship. It teaches the heir how to manage power before he wears the crown. It gives him independence before he inherits the throne. And it allows the public to see in quiet details what kind of monarch he may become. For King Charles III, the duchy was a platform for personal vision. For Prince William, it may become something else, a test of boundaries, accountability, and generational change. And once that possibility appears, the story moves into far more sensitive territory. Because if William is willing to quietly change the arrangements surrounding Queen Camilla's family now, while King Charles III is still on the throne, what does that suggest about the influence he may choose to accept or remove when the monarchy eventually passes into his hands? And that is where the story becomes more complicated, because the decision did not land inside an ordinary family business. It landed inside a monarchy where property, titles, households, loyalties, and personal history are all tied together in ways the public rarely sees. A name removed from a payroll may look small on paper, but inside royal life, access is never just access. It is recognition. It is trust. It is a sign of who belongs close to power. For years, the royal system has depended on a careful separation between what is personal and what is institutional. The crown must look larger than family feeling. The household must appear disciplined. The estates must be managed as historic responsibilities, not private rewards. But the British royal family is still a family, and that is where the pressure begins. Behind every formal title, there are old wounds, old loyalties, and private relationships that never completely disappear. So when Prince William allowed the Duchy of Cornwall to move forward without Annabel Elliot in that familiar position, the question was not simply whether one contract had ended. The deeper question was whether the Prince of Wales was beginning to separate his future court from the emotional arrangements of his father's generation. And if that interpretation is right, then this was not a small administrative adjustment. It was a quiet preview of a different royal style. William has always understood that his future depends on public trust. Unlike monarchs of a distant past, a modern king cannot rely only on tradition, ceremony, or inherited affection. He must show judgment. He must show restraint. He must convince the public that privilege is being handled carefully at a time when every royal expense, every property, every private benefit, and every family connection is examined with far greater suspicion than before. That is why the duchy matters so much. It is not just a beautiful historic estate with farms, cottages, and ancient rights. It is one of the most visible examples of royal wealth operating in a modern democratic age. It gives the heir independence, but it also invites scrutiny. The moment William took control of it, he inherited not only its income and land, but also its reputation. Every choice he makes there becomes part of the public's understanding of what kind of king he might one day be. And that creates a difficult position for Queen Camilla. Her role beside King Charles has become more established in recent years, especially as she has continued royal duties during a challenging period for the king and the wider family. Many observers have noted her steadiness, her long experience, and her loyalty to Charles. But her public position remains unusual because it rests on acceptance that was built slowly, painfully, and never universally. For some viewers, she is now simply the queen, performing the duties expected of her. For others, the memory of Diana still shapes every interpretation of Camilla's place in the royal story. That divided memory means that even an ordinary decision involving Camilla's family can become emotionally charged. It touches a nerve that never fully healed. It reminds the public that the monarchy's present is still connected to the most painful chapters of its past. And it places William in an almost impossible emotional landscape. He must behave like a future king, but he is also the son of a woman whose life remains central to how millions understand the modern royal family. That is the hidden tension beneath this moment, because if William had continued every arrangement exactly as he inherited it, some might have seen that as maturity, continuity, and family peace. But others may have interpreted it as a willingness to preserve a system of personal closeness around the queen's relatives. If he changes those arrangements, some may call it practical reform, while others may see a private message being sent through institutional channels. In royal life, even restraint can be read as strategy. And this is why the palace's silence becomes so important. There was no dramatic explanation, because a dramatic explanation would have created a larger story. There was no emotional statement, because emotion would have made the decision look personal. Instead, the matter remained wrapped in the language of professional transition. That is often how the monarchy manages difficult questions, not by answering every suspicion, but by lowering the temperature until the public moves on. But this time, the public did not move on so quickly. Royal watchers began looking at the decision as part of a broader pattern. They asked whether William was quietly reducing the number of people connected to the old Charles and Camilla circle. They asked whether he wanted the duchy to reflect his own priorities rather than his father's household habits. And they asked whether the future king was using the power he already has to prepare for the larger power he will one day inherit. That possibility changes the whole meaning of the story. Because William does not yet sit on the throne, but he is no longer waiting passively in the background. He is already shaping institutions that will define his reign. He is already learning where loyalty ends and responsibility begins. He is already facing the question every future monarch must face. When the time comes, do you preserve what you inherited, or do you correct what you believe no longer serves the crown? For King Charles, this may be one of the most delicate parts of the transition. Charles spent decades building his own royal world before becoming monarch. He had his own advisors, his own rhythms, his own charitable passions, his own estates, and his own trusted people. The Duchy of Cornwall was not merely a source of income, it was part of his identity. It gave him space to act, experiment, and build influence long before he became king. Now that same instrument belongs to his eldest son, and that means William is not just inheriting from Charles. He is editing Charles's legacy. That is a sensitive thing in any family. In a monarchy, it becomes historic, because every generational change inside the royal family is presented publicly as smooth continuity, but privately it can involve difficult choices about what must remain and what must quietly end. The public sees balcony appearances, state occasions, and carefully arranged photographs. But the true transfer of power often happens in less visible places: appointments, residences, finances, invitations, staff lists, estate policies, and the private rules about who is allowed close enough to matter. This is where the story becomes much larger than Annabel Elliot. It begins to touch the question of what William's monarchy may feel like. Will it be leaner, more controlled, more protective of public perception? Will it draw stronger boundaries around family members and personal networks? Will it be less sentimental about arrangements that once seemed untouchable because they belonged to Charles's world? And if so, where does that leave Camilla? Not today, perhaps. Today, she remains queen beside her husband. She continues her duties. She appears at major royal moments. She is part of the visible structure of the reign. But royal status can be surprisingly dependent on timing. The same person who looks secure in one reign may become far more vulnerable in the next. That is not cruelty. It is the nature of monarchy. Titles move, roles change, houses change hands. Influence rises and fades according to the person wearing the crown. That is why this moment has such quiet force. It is not that William has publicly challenged Camilla. He has not. It is not that the palace has confirmed a family dispute. It has not. The significance is more subtle than that. For the first time, the public saw a decision that seemed to show William acting from his own authority, inside a space once shaped by his father, and touching someone close to Camilla's private world. Was this about efficiency, accountability, and a new professional direction? Or was it also the beginning of a boundary being drawn around the next reign? That is the question that makes the story difficult to dismiss. Because behind the visible decision, another issue was beginning to emerge. Not simply who lost access, but who would be allowed to keep influence when William's vision for the monarchy started to take shape. Because once influence becomes the real subject, the story stops being about decoration, contracts, or even one familiar name on a financial document. It becomes about the quiet architecture of royal power, who is trusted, who is protected, who is gradually moved aside, and who is allowed to remain close enough to shape the atmosphere around the future king. That is why this decision felt so revealing to many royal watchers. The monarchy does not usually announce a change of mood. It does not call a press conference to say that one era is ending and another is beginning. Instead, the signs appear slowly, almost politely. A role is not renewed. A circle becomes smaller. A familiar presence is no longer required. And by the time the public notices, the deeper shift may already be underway. For William, the question of influence is not abstract. It is tied to everything he has lived through as a son, a husband, and an heir. He has seen how private relationships can become public storms. He has seen how personal loyalty, when handled carelessly, can damage the reputation of the crown. He has watched the monarchy survive crisis after crisis by appearing calm on the outside while pressure built intensely behind the palace walls. And that may explain why his approach appears so careful. He does not need to make loud gestures to be understood. In fact, loudness would work against him. The future king's strength has often been his ability to let a decision speak through its consequences rather than through emotion. If the Duchy of Cornwall is now being shaped more firmly around his own standards, then the message is not theatrical. It is institutional. But was this really only about professional standards? Or was it also about preventing the next reign from carrying too many unresolved complications from the last? That question matters because the British royal family is entering a fragile period. King Charles III has spent much of his life waiting to become monarch, but his reign began at a time when the institution was already facing deep public scrutiny. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex, had stepped away from royal duties and reshaped the family's public image from the outside. Catherine, Princess of Wales, became central to the monarchy's emotional future, admired by many as a steady figure of continuity. And William, standing between his father's reign and his own, became the person on whom much of the institution's long-term stability seemed to rest. In that context, even a small internal change becomes part of a larger question. How much of Charles's world will William preserve, and how much will he quietly redesign? The answer may not come all at once. It may come through choices that look ordinary until they are placed together. The Prince of Wales may continue supporting the king in public, standing beside him at national moments, honoring the dignity of the current reign, and avoiding any open sign of division. But support does not always mean imitation. Loyalty does not always mean agreement. And continuity does not always mean preserving every private arrangement that came before. That is where Queen Camilla's position becomes especially delicate. She is not outside the monarchy. She is at the center of the present reign. Yet she also belongs emotionally and historically to one of the most controversial chapters in modern royal memory. Her supporters may see her as resilient, dutiful, and unfairly judged for a past that the family itself has moved beyond. Her critics may still see her through the pain of Diana's story, unable or unwilling to separate the queen of today from the woman once blamed for yesterday's heartbreak. William must navigate both realities. If he appears too harsh, he risks looking ungenerous and personally driven. If he appears too passive, he risks allowing the future monarchy to be defined by old loyalties that may not serve its public image. And if he makes changes quietly, as he appears to have done with the duchy, people begin asking whether silence itself is the strategy. This is why the story has attracted such strong reaction. It gives viewers something rare, a glimpse of how the next reign may be prepared before the throne actually changes hands. Not through speeches, not through balcony appearances, but through the less glamorous machinery of royal life, where money, property, appointments, and access reveal the shape of authority. And there is another layer beneath this. The monarchy is not just managing family feeling, it is managing public confidence. At a time when younger generations are more likely to question inherited privilege, William cannot afford a future court that appears careless with personal connections. He knows the next chapter of royal leadership will require a sharper sense of accountability. The old assumption that royal circles could operate without explanation is fading. Every decision now exists in a world of screenshots, annual reports, headlines, commentary panels, and public debate. So if the duchy is becoming more disciplined under his leadership, that may not be only a family signal. It may also be a message to the country. The future king understands the temperature of the times. He understands that the monarchy must look cleaner, leaner, and more defensible. He understands that the public will accept tradition more easily when tradition appears responsible. But there is a risk in that approach as well. Reform inside a family monarchy is never purely technical. When changes touch people close to the queen, they can be read emotionally, even if they are justified professionally. A decision intended to protect the institution may still be received as a personal slight. A boundary drawn for the future may reopen wounds from the past. And a move designed to reduce controversy may create fresh speculation precisely because it was handled so quietly. That is the contradiction at the heart of William's position. To modernize the monarchy, he may have to disturb people who benefited from its older habits. To protect its reputation, he may have to limit access that once felt normal. To prepare for his own reign, he may have to make choices that remind everyone Charles's reign is not the final shape of the institution, but a bridge to something else. And perhaps that is why the removal of one name carried such weight. It was not the size of the payment that mattered. It was the direction of travel. It suggested that William's authority is no longer theoretical. It is already operating. It is already making judgments. It is already deciding which parts of the inherited royal world belong in the future, and which parts may quietly remain in the past. But even that did not explain the most sensitive part of the story, because the real question was no longer simply whether William was changing the duchy. It was whether those changes were beginning to reveal how he might handle Queen Camilla's place in the monarchy when the protection of the current reign is no longer there. That question is where the pressure begins to sharpen, because Queen Camilla's position is not only a matter of affection, marriage, or public acceptance. It is also a matter of reign. While Charles sits on the throne, Camilla stands beside him as queen, protected by his authority, his household, and the ceremonial structure of the present monarchy. But every royal role is shaped by the person at the center of the crown, and the next person at the center will not be Charles. That is why the timing of William's decisions matters so much. A future king does not need to announce a future policy in order to reveal a future instinct. He reveals it through the kind of people he keeps close, the kind of arrangements he allows to continue, and the kind of inherited privileges he chooses not to renew. And once royal watchers saw that someone so close to Camilla's private family world was no longer part of the duchy's paid circle, the question became impossible to avoid. Was this a single decision, or the first sign of a much stricter future? The most sensitive part is that Camilla's security has always depended on more than public goodwill. Her rise inside the royal family required time, patience, careful image building, and the steady protection of Charles himself. For years, the palace worked to soften public feeling, to present her as dutiful rather than divisive, and to move the country gradually from resistance to acceptance. That effort did not happen overnight. It was one of the longest public rehabilitation campaigns in modern royal history. But rehabilitation is not the same as permanence. A queen by marriage occupies a powerful position, but it is also a position tied to the life and reign of the monarch she married. The moment the crown passes to William, the emotional balance inside the family changes. Catherine becomes the queen beside him. William becomes the source of royal authority. And Camilla, whatever title or style is eventually used, moves into a different chapter. Still royal, still historically significant, but no longer the woman at the monarch's side. That shift may sound formal, but inside a family monarchy, formality can be life-changing. Residences, invitations, staff, public visibility, ceremonial prominence, and private access all depend on the atmosphere of a reign. The palace may describe such changes with calm language, but the human meaning is far more complicated. One day, Camilla could find herself living under a royal structure shaped not by her husband's instincts, but by William's judgment. And that is where this story begins to feel less like a staffing matter and more like a succession issue. Some royal commentators have suggested that William's future reign may be more streamlined, more controlled, and more conscious of public criticism than his father's. That would not be surprising. The Prince of Wales has grown up in an age where monarchy is constantly examined, where royal spending becomes political discussion, and where public sympathy cannot be taken for granted. If he wants the crown to survive with dignity, he may believe that boundaries must be clearer than they were in previous generations. But clearer boundaries can also create personal consequences. For Camilla's family, the message may already feel uncomfortable. The old assumption that closeness to the king and queen naturally brings a place within royal life may not carry the same weight with William. In the next reign, access may be earned differently. Personal history may be judged differently. And family connection, once seen as a quiet advantage, may become something the institution prefers to limit rather than display. Was this about protecting the monarchy from accusations of favoritism? Was it about making the duchy look more professional under new leadership? Or was it also a careful warning that the future court will not be an extension of Charles and Camilla's private world? The palace has not publicly confirmed any hidden motive, and it would be irresponsible to claim certainty. But royal power often works through signals, not explanations. The most consequential message may be the one never spoken aloud. And in this case, the signal was difficult to miss. William inherited an estate shaped by his father, and one of the first visible changes touched the Queen's own family. That is a turning point because it shows authority moving from theory into practice. For many years, William's future power existed mainly in conversation. People spoke of what he might do one day, how he might rule, how he might balance tradition with modern expectation, and how he might handle the emotional shadows left by the past. But now, in the duchy, he has a real institution under his control. He can appoint, he can remove, he can revise, he can allow old arrangements to fade without making a public spectacle of them. And that makes every future decision more meaningful. If this approach continues, it could affect far more than one family member. It could shape the entire culture of the next royal household. A William-led monarchy may place greater emphasis on discipline, fewer informal privileges, tighter circles, and a stronger division between public duty and private loyalty. That would appeal to many people who want the crown to appear serious and accountable. But it could also make the transition more uncomfortable for those who became used to Charles's more personal style of royal management. There is also the matter of public perception. Camilla has worked for years to secure a place in national life, but public feeling remains layered. Every time her family is linked to royal benefit, critics are reminded of old suspicions. Every time William appears to draw a boundary, Diana's memory quietly enters the conversation again. Not because William needs to mention his mother, but because the public carries that history for him. This is the emotional force the palace cannot fully control. A decision can be professional and still be interpreted through grief. A change can be practical and still feel symbolic. A future king can act responsibly and still awaken memories that belong to the most painful years of his childhood. That is the burden William carries. He must make decisions for the monarchy, while knowing that millions will read those decisions through the story of Diana, Charles, and Camilla. And for Charles, that creates a deeply delicate situation. He needs William as the future of the crown, He needs Camilla protected within the present reign. He needs the public to see unity, not quiet division. Yet the very process of preparing William for kingship means accepting that his son will not always preserve the world exactly as he received it. That is where the real consequence begins. The duchy decision did not overthrow anything. It did not publicly challenge Camilla. It did not create an official rupture. But it revealed a power shift already in motion, one that could become far more visible when the throne eventually changes hands. Because the real consequence was not only what happened in that moment, it was what that moment revealed about the future, a future in which William may be respectful, careful, and composed, but not necessarily sentimental about the arrangements that once protected Queen Camilla's closest circle. And that is why this story lingers long after the detail itself appears to have passed. Because in royal life, the most important developments are not always the ones wrapped in ceremony. Sometimes the true meaning lies in what changes quietly, what is no longer renewed, what is allowed to fade, and what those choices reveal about the instincts of the person preparing to inherit the crown. For William, the issue is not simply whether one arrangement from the past continues into the future. The larger question is whether the next reign can afford to carry the emotional weight, public suspicion, and private loyalties that shaped the reign before it. Every future monarch inherits more than palaces and titles. They inherit memories. They inherit unresolved questions. They inherit the public's trust, but also the public's doubts. And once those doubts attach themselves to questions of access, family connection, and royal privilege, they become much harder for the institution to ignore. That is the part that gives this moment its historical importance. The monarchy has survived for so long because it knows how to adapt without appearing to surrender. It changes slowly, carefully, and often without admitting that change is happening at all. A household becomes smaller, a public role is reshaped, a tradition is adjusted, a familiar name disappears from the machinery of royal life. To the casual observer, these may look like separate events, but to those who watch the monarchy closely, they can suggest a pattern. And the pattern here points toward a future in which William may be less willing to blur the line between personal loyalty and institutional discipline. That does not mean hostility. It does not mean revenge. Buckingham Palace has not publicly confirmed any personal motive behind the decision, and it would be wrong to claim certainty where none exists. But interpretation matters in royal life, because the monarchy is not only governed by documents and titles, it is also governed by symbolism. And symbolically, this was powerful. A new Duke of Cornwall took control of an ancient estate. A connection from the previous royal circle did not continue in the same way. The public noticed. Commentators began asking questions. And suddenly, a decision that might once have remained buried in paperwork became part of a much larger conversation about the future of the British royal family. For Queen Camilla, the lesson is equally complex. Her position today remains visible, respected in official terms, and protected by the current reign. She has carried out duties, supported charitable causes, and stood beside Charles during a demanding period for the monarchy. But her story has always been different from that of queens born into royal expectation. Her public acceptance was earned gradually, and for many people it remains emotionally complicated. That means her future will always be watched through two lenses: the constitutional role she holds now, and the memory of how difficult her arrival at the center of royal life once was. This is why William's future choices will matter so much. He does not need to punish anyone to reshape the monarchy. He does not need to speak harshly, reopen old wounds, or turn private history into public theater. The more likely path, if this moment is any guide, is quieter and more controlled. He may simply decide what continues, what ends, who remains close, and how tightly the next reign protects its public image. That is power in its most royal form. Not loud, not emotional, not immediate, but lasting. The deeper consequence is that the monarchy may be entering a phase where emotional history and public accountability can no longer be kept apart. For decades, the royal family has asked the public to accept continuity. Charles after Elizabeth, William after Charles, Catherine beside William, and the institution moving forward as though each transition is smooth and inevitable. But behind that smoothness are human relationships shaped by grief, loyalty, regret, ambition, and memory. The public may not know every private detail, but it understands the emotional outline. It understands that Diana's legacy still lives through William. It understands that Camilla's role still carries complicated history. It understands that Charles's reign is both a culmination of his long life's work and a bridge toward a monarchy that will one day belong to his son. And it understands that when William makes even a quiet decision involving people close to Camilla's world, the meaning will never be only administrative. This is where the story becomes less about one estate and more about succession itself. A future king is already learning how to govern the spaces he controls. He is already deciding what kind of tone his leadership will carry. He is already discovering that modern monarchy requires more than dignity and tradition. It requires judgment, restraint, and the ability to recognize when an old arrangement no longer fits a new age. For royal observers, the next signs may not come through dramatic headlines. They may come through smaller shifts: who appears at family gatherings, who receives public prominence, how royal households are structured, which traditions are preserved, and which private connections quietly lose influence. The final shape of William's monarchy will not be revealed in a single moment. It will be built through a series of choices, each one telling the public a little more about the kind of king he intends to become. And that leaves two possible interpretations. Perhaps this was simply a sensible transition, the kind any responsible new steward would make when taking charge of a major estate. Perhaps it was about professionalism, efficiency, and ensuring that the duchy reflects William's own priorities rather than the habits of the past. That is the calmest reading, and it may be the official one. But there is another possibility. This may also be a sign that the future king is already drawing boundaries around the next reign, quietly separating his monarchy from the private networks and emotional compromises that define the last generation. If that is true, then this story was never just about Queen Camilla's family. It was about the moment William began showing that respect for his father's reign does not mean surrendering the future shape of his own. So what do you think? Was this simply one royal development, or does it point to a much larger shift inside the monarchy? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep royal analysis, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next documentary-style royal story. Because in the House of Windsor, the future rarely arrives with a declaration. More often, it arrives through silence, through timing, and through one quiet decision that tells everyone the next chapter has already begun.